In the scorching summer of 1889, beneath the relentless Texas sun, Emily Carson faces a devil's bargain that will determine the rest of her life. With her father dying and debts crushing their small ranch, the only salvation comes wrapped in chains: marriage to Clayton Hayes, the ruthless cattle baron whose first wife died under mysterious circumstances. As the wedding bells prepare to toll her doom, a stranger emerges from the dust and danger of the frontier. Jack Mason, a battle-scarred rancher with secrets of his own and a reputation forged in blood and honor, makes her an offer that changes everything. "I'll save you from a forced marriage with Hayes, but in the end, you will be my wife." What follows is not just an escape, but an epic journey across untamed lands where love and survival walk hand in hand, where every choice could mean life or death, and where two wounded souls must learn to trust each other against impossible odds. For more epic tales of frontier romance, courage, and the wild hearts that refuse to be tamed, stay with this channel and ride into adventure. The wooden floors of the Carson ranch house creaked under Emily's worn boots as she moved between her father's bedside and the small kitchen where she prepared his meager meals. Thomas Carson lay gaunt and hollow-eyed, his breathing labored from the consumption that had been eating away at his lungs for months. Emily was 21, but the responsibilities weighing on her shoulders had aged her beyond her years. Every morning brought new bills they couldn't pay, new threats from creditors, and the ever-present specter of losing everything her family had worked to build in Red Willow, Texas. The heat outside was merciless, turning the earth to dust and driving even the hardiest cattle to seek shade beneath the scattered mesquite trees. Emily pressed a damp cloth to her father's fevered brow, watching as his eyes flickered open to meet hers. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the buzz of flies against the window. "That man Hayes came by again yesterday while you were in town. He's made his final offer." Emily's heart sank. Clayton Hayes owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, a man whose wealth was matched only by his ruthlessness. His shadow fell across Red Willow like a permanent storm cloud, and few dared to cross him. Hayes was past 40, with cold gray eyes and hands that had never known gentleness. The rumors about his first wife's death 2 years into their marriage followed him like hungry vultures, whispered in saloons and church pews alike. "He'll pay for the doctor from Austin," Thomas continued, each word an effort. "Settle all our debts with the bank and the general store. Give us enough to live comfortable for the rest of my days." He paused, unable to meet his daughter's gaze. "All he wants in return is your hand in marriage. The wedding's set for Sunday." Emily stood abruptly, the cloth falling to the floor with a wet slap. Through the cracked window she could see Hayes's men in the distance, Jake Morrison and 2 other ranch hands, watching their property with the patience of predators. Morrison was Hayes's foreman, a man whose loyalty was bought with gold and maintained through fear. His presence meant Hayes was serious about collecting what he believed he was owed. "I won't do it, Papa," Emily said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Mama wouldn't have wanted this for me." Thomas Carson's face crumpled. "Your mama's been dead 4 years, child, and I'll be joining her soon enough. You think I want to sell you like cattle? But what choice do we have? You'll starve without protection, and Hayes, at least with him, you'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly." Emily fled the suffocating room, her mother's old boots carrying her quickly across the dusty yard to the small stable where Buttercup, their elderly mare, stood patient and gentle in her stall. Emily buried her face in the horse's mane, tears flowing freely as she remembered her mother's final words. "Be strong, my desert flower. Don't let anyone break your spirit, no matter what storms come." The next 2 days passed in a haze of unwanted preparations. The women of Red Willow descended upon the Carson ranch like a flock of concerned crows, bringing a borrowed wedding dress and supplies for what they called the celebration. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house clucked her tongue sympathetically while fitting the dress. Mr. Hayes isn't so bad once you get used to his ways, dear. You'll have servants, fine clothes, maybe even travel to Austin or San Antonio. Many girls would consider themselves fortunate, but Emily had seen the bruises on the Mexican girls who worked in Hayes's grand house. She'd heard the whispered stories about screams in the night and servants who disappeared without explanation. The thought of Hayes's hands on her made her skin crawl like ants in summer heat. On the night before the wedding, Emily lay awake listening to her father's labored breathing and the mournful howl of coyotes in the distance. The moon cast silver light through her small window, illuminating the wedding dress hanging on a wooden peg like a funeral shroud. As the hours ticked by, her desperation crystallized into determination. She would not be traded like livestock, no matter the cost. Moving with silent purpose, Emily gathered what little she could carry, a canvas sack with dried beans and jerky, her mother's silver locket, the only valuable thing she owned, and her father's hidden Colt revolver that he'd kept since his days in the Union Army. She saddled Buttercup with trembling hands, whispering apologies to the darkness for abandoning her dying father, but knowing she had no choice if she wanted to preserve what remained of her soul. The Texas night was cooler than the blazing days, and Emily urged Buttercup into the darkness, following cattle trails she'd known since childhood. She had no clear destination, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and the fate that awaited her at sunrise. The landscape around Red Willow was harsh but familiar. Rolling hills dotted with prickly pear and mesquite, cut through by dry creek beds that would run wild during the brief rainy season. Emily had ridden perhaps 10 miles when she heard the sound that chilled her blood, the thunder of hoofbeats behind her, growing steadily closer. Hayes's men had discovered her flight sooner than she'd hoped. Morrison and 2 ranch hands caught up with her near Devil's Canyon, where flash floods had carved deep channels in the red earth. Rough hands dragged her from Buttercup's back, and Emily fought like a wildcat, clawing and biting until Morrison's open palm cracked across her face, sending stars exploding across her vision. "Thought you could run from Mr. Hayes, did you?" Morrison sneered, grabbing Emily by her long brown hair. "He don't take kindly to his property trying to escape. You're gonna learn some manners before this night's through." "I'm not his property," Emily spat, blood trickling from her split lip. Morrison's laugh was harsh as grinding stone. "You will become morning, and he'll teach you proper respect for your husband, even if I have to break you first." It was then, as hope seemed to die beneath the indifferent stars, that a new figure materialized from the shadows between the rocks. Tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence, the stranger seemed to emerge from the very landscape itself. In the moonlight, Emily caught a glimpse of dark hair beneath a weather-beaten hat, sun-weathered skin, and eyes that burned with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The stranger spoke just once. "Let her go." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. Morrison turned with a sneer. "This ain't your concern, Mason." "Ride on." The man called Mason moved like lightning. His knife found Morrison's throat before the foreman could clear his holster, and the other 2 men fell before their guns could speak, Mason's bullets finding their marks with deadly precision. In less than 30 seconds, 3 bodies lay still on the blood-soaked earth, and Emily found herself staring up at her unexpected savior. Jack Mason was perhaps 27 years old, with sharp cheekbones and a network of scars that spoke of battles survived. He wore the practical clothes of a working rancher, leather chaps, cotton shirt, and a bandana around his neck. A Winchester rifle was slung across his back, and his hands moved with the easy competence of a man who'd learned to live by his wits and his gun. "You're running from Hayes," Mason said, studying Emily with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Emily nodded, finding her voice at last. "They were taking me back to marry him." Something flickered in Mason's expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who refused to be caged. "Hayes has destroyed enough lives. I won't let him claim yours." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of destiny. "I'll save you from a forced marriage with him, but I have a price. In the end, you'll be my wife." Emily recoiled, but Mason's gaze remained steady. "Not as property," he said quietly, "as a partner. But out here, survival comes first, and sometimes fate chooses for us." Before Emily could respond, the sound of approaching riders echoed off the canyon walls. Hayes wouldn't send just 3 men to retrieve his prize. Emily looked at this dangerous stranger who'd killed for her without hesitation, weighing her impossible choices. She took his offered hand. Jack Mason's grip was strong and calloused as he pulled Emily to her feet. Without ceremony, he whistled low and sharp, and a paint horse emerged from the shadows, a magnificent animal with a coat of black and white patches that seemed to blend with the moonlit landscape. Mason lifted Emily onto the horse's back, then swung up behind her, his arm settling around her waist with surprising gentleness. "Your mare's too slow," he explained, slapping Buttercup's rump to send her trotting back toward Red Willow. "She'll find her way home and hopefully convince them you're dead in a fall." They rode hard through the night, following paths invisible to Emily but clearly familiar to Mason. His knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic. He knew every hidden spring, every narrow passage between the towering rock formations, every place where a horse could find footing on treacherous slopes. As they climbed higher into the hill country, the air grew cooler and the landscape more rugged. Dawn found them in a natural amphitheater of red stone, where a small spring bubbled up from deep underground to form a clear pool no bigger than a washtub. Emily's body ached from the hard ride, her torn dress offering little protection against the morning chill, but she was alive and free. Mason dismounted first, then helped her down with careful hands, his touch respectful despite their intimate circumstances. In the growing light, Emily could see him more clearly. Jack Mason was handsome, in a way the town boys had never been, all sharp angles and controlled power, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw only added to his dangerous appeal, speaking of a man who'd survived what would have killed lesser men. "Drink," Mason commanded, handing her the tin cup from his saddlebags. The spring water was cold and sweet, better than anything Emily had tasted in months. As she drank, Mason unpacked supplies from a hidden cache among the rocks: dried beef, hardtack, coffee, and a wool blanket that smelled of sage and wood smoke. "Why?" Emily asked, the question encompassing everything that had happened. Why save her? Why kill for her? Why claim her as his own? Mason was quiet for a long moment, checking his horse and scanning the horizon with the eternal vigilance of a man who lived always on guard. "Hayes killed my sister 2 winters ago," he said finally. "Sarah was only 16, gathering herbs near Willow Creek when his men found her. They used her, then left her body for the vultures." Emily's hand flew to her mouth in horror. She'd heard whispers of such atrocities, but had never known the victims had families who mourned them, who sought justice in a land where the law served only those with money and influence. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, the words feeling inadequate. Mason's jaw tightened. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. But when I saw you fighting them, saw the same fear in your eyes that I saw in Sarah's." He looked at Emily directly, his dark eyes burning with purpose. "No woman should be forced into anything. Not by them, not by anyone." "Including you?" Emily challenged, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "You said I'd be your wife." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "I said, in the end." "The end is a long way off, Emily Carson. First, you have to survive long enough to choose." Over the following days, Mason taught Emily the skills she'd need to stay alive in the wilderness. He showed her how to read the landscape for signs of water, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently across rocky ground without leaving tracks. He demonstrated the use of his rifle, patiently correcting her stance and breathing until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. Most importantly, he taught her to think like prey that refuses to be caught. Your people make too much noise, Mason observed, watching Emily practice walking silently. You move like you own the world, but out here, the world owns you. Emily learned quickly, driven by necessity and a growing respect for her enigmatic protector. Mason was a patient teacher when she struggled, quietly pleased when she succeeded, and fiercely protective when danger threatened. He told her stories of the frontier, of cattle drives and Indian raids, of men who carved empires from dust and determination, of women who stood beside their men as equals in the face of impossible odds. Their relationship deepened through shared hardship and mutual respect. Mason spoke little of his past, but Emily gradually pieced together his story: a ranch destroyed by Hayes's greed, a family scattered to the winds, a man left with nothing but his skills and his burning need for justice. In return, Emily shared her own sorrows: her mother's death from fever, her father's slow decline, her dreams of seeing the world beyond Red Willow's dusty streets. "You're stronger than you know," Mason told her one evening as they sat by their small fire, the vast Texas sky spread above them like a blanket sewn with stars. Running took courage. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. Living takes more. Their laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of hope in a landscape that had seen too much sorrow. As the days passed, Emily found herself drawn not just to Mason's strength and competence, but to the gentleness he showed when he thought no one was watching, the way he tended her blistered feet without comment, the soft songs he hummed while standing guard, the careful way he built their fires to give warmth without revealing their position. Meanwhile, in Red Willow, Hayes's fury was building like a summer thunderstorm. The discovery of Morrison's body and the evidence of Emily's rescue had sent him into a rage that terrified even his most loyal men. He doubled the reward for Emily's return and hired every gun for hire between the Pecos and the Brazos. Wanted posters appeared in every saloon and general store, describing Emily as a kidnapped woman and Mason as a dangerous outlaw. Thomas Carson, recovering slowly from his illness thanks to medicine provided by concerned neighbors, wept when he learned of his daughter's flight. He knew Hayes well enough to understand that Emily's defiance would not be forgiven, and that her continued freedom depended on staying ahead of men who made their living from hunting other human beings. The pursuit was relentless and cunning. Hayes employed Apache trackers who could follow a trail across solid rock, bounty hunters who knew every hiding place in 3 states, and corrupt lawmen who cared nothing for justice. Emily and Mason were forced to constantly move, never staying in one place for more than a night, always alert for the sound of approaching horses or the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. It was during one such flight that Emily's ankle twisted badly on loose shale, sending her tumbling down a steep slope. Mason was beside her instantly, his hands gentle as he examined the injury. The ankle wasn't broken, but it was badly sprained, and Emily knew she couldn't walk on it. "Leave me," she whispered, tears of pain and frustration streaming down her face. "I'll only slow you down." Mason's response was to tear strips from his own shirt for bandages, then lift Emily onto his back with surprising tenderness. "We stay together," he said simply. "That's what partners do." For 2 days, Mason carried Emily through terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat, never complaining, never showing the strain. At night, he tended her injury with herbs he'd learned to use from his sister, his touch gentle, despite his calloused hands. It was during those vulnerable hours that Emily began to understand the depth of Mason's character, his quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, his capacity for both violence and tenderness. "Why do you care so much?" Emily asked one night as Mason checked her bandages by firelight. Mason's hands stilled on the makeshift bandage. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters, and because—" He looked up at her, his dark eyes vulnerable for just a moment. "Because you make me remember what I'm fighting for." Emily's heart raced at the intensity in his voice, at the careful way he touched her, at the growing awareness that what lay between them was more than just survival. When Mason's fingers brushed her cheek, she didn't pull away. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. It tasted of wood smoke and hope, of shared danger and growing trust. When they finally broke apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I meant what I said about marriage," he whispered, "but only if you choose it freely. Only if you want me as much as I want you." Emily's answer was another kiss, this one deeper and more certain. "I choose you, Jack Mason. I choose us." Their declaration of love was interrupted by the distant sound of gunfire. Hayes' men had found their trail again. Mason swept Emily into his arms, carrying her to where their horse waited, and once again they fled into the night. But now they ran as more than allies. They ran as two people who had found something worth fighting for in each other. The cat and mouse game continued for weeks, taking them deep into the hill country where few men dared to venture. Mason's knowledge of the terrain kept them ahead of their pursuers, but Emily could see the toll it was taking on him. He grew thinner, more haggard, constantly alert for danger. She did what she could to help, learning to pack their gear quickly, to read the signs that warned of approaching riders, to shoot straight when their lives depended on it. They encountered others along the way, fellow refugees from Hayes's tyranny, homesteaders driven from their land, Mexican families fleeing north to escape violence. Mason and Emily helped when they could, sharing their meager supplies and offering protection to those who couldn't protect themselves. Word of their generosity spread along the hidden networks of the dispossessed, and gradually they found allies where they'd expected only enemies. One such ally was Maria Gonzalez, a widow whose husband had been murdered by Hayes's men for refusing to sell his small ranch. Maria hid them in her root cellar when a posse came through, then sent them on their way with fresh horses and a bag of supplies. "You give hope to people like us," she told Emily. "You show that sometimes the little ones can win." The final confrontation came in early autumn, when the oppressive heat of summer was beginning to break and the first cool winds promised relief. Hayes had cornered them in a box canyon with no apparent way out, leading a force of 20 armed men. Mason counted their ammunition, enough for perhaps 10 minutes of fighting, and began planning their last stand. "I won't let them take you alive," he promised Emily, his rifle trained on the canyon mouth. Emily's response was to check her own weapon, her hand steady despite the circumstances. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen." The battle was fierce, but brief. Mason's reputation as a marksman proved well-founded, and Emily's accuracy surprised even herself. But it was the arrival of unexpected allies that turned the tide. Mexican vaqueros led by Maria's eldest son, displaced ranchers seeking their own justice, even some of Hayes's own men who'd grown sick of his brutality. The canyon filled with gun smoke and war cries, and when it cleared, Hayes lay dead in the dust, his empire of fear finally broken. The aftermath was complex. Legal proceedings in Austin cleared Mason and Emily of any wrongdoing, ruling Hayes's death justified and his treatment of the local population criminal. Emily's father, recovered enough to travel, embraced his daughter with tears of pride and relief. The people of Red Willow, freed from Hayes's shadow, began the slow process of rebuilding their community on foundations of justice rather than fear. Emily and Mason were married that autumn in a simple ceremony at the rebuilt church in Red Willow. She wore a new dress, white as prairie cotton and simple as her mother would have wanted. Mason stood beside her in his best clothes, scarred but proud, his love for her evident to everyone present. Thomas Carson walked his daughter down the aisle, his health restored and his faith in her choices vindicated. Their wedding was a celebration not just of love, but of freedom, the freedom to choose, to fight for what's right, to build something better from the ashes of what came before. As Emily and Mason spoke their vows under the vast Texas sky, their guests included Mexican families, displaced ranchers, former outlaws seeking redemption, and townspeople who had learned the value of standing together against tyranny. The years that followed brought their own challenges: drought that tested their resolve, cattle rustlers who threatened their livelihood, the endless struggle to build prosperity from hard work and determination. But Emily and Mason faced each trial as partners, their love strengthened by the hardships they'd overcome together. They built their ranch into a refuge for others seeking new starts, a place where past mistakes could be forgiven and future dreams nurtured. Emily established a school for the local children, teaching them not just reading and arithmetic, but the value of courage and compassion. Mason became a leader in the growing movement for fair treatment of Mexican workers and honest dealing in cattle trading. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah in honor of Mason's lost sister, was born in the spring of their third year together. Emily held the baby while Mason looked on with wonder, both of them amazed by the miracle of new life emerging from their love. More children followed, strong boys and spirited girls who grew up knowing they were cherished, who learned from their parents' example that love freely given is the greatest force in the world. On quiet evenings, Emily and Mason would sit on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their children playing in the yard while Buttercup, now ancient but still gentle, grazed peacefully nearby. Sometimes Emily would touch the silver locket at her throat, thinking of her mother and the courage she'd passed down through the generations. "Any regrets?" Mason would ask, his arm around Emily's shoulders as they watched their world settle into peace. "None," Emily would answer, leaning into his warmth. "Every choice led us here, to this moment, to this life we've built together." And in the gathering dusk of the Texas frontier, with the scent of sage on the wind and the promise of tomorrow in their hearts, Emily Carson Mason knew that love freely chosen would always triumph over fear imposed by force. Their story became legend, told around campfires and in saloon corners, shared by travelers and treasured by dreamers who believed that sometimes, just sometimes, the good ones win in the end. Years later, when Emily was an old woman with silver hair and gentle hands, she would tell her grandchildren about the night a stranger rode out of the darkness to save her from a forced marriage, and how she learned that the greatest love stories are born not from fairy tales, but from the courage to choose your own destiny and fight for what your heart knows is right. The legacy of Emily and Jack Mason lived on in the thriving community they'd helped build, in the children they'd raised to value freedom and justice, and in the enduring truth that love, when freely given and fiercely protected, can transform even the harshest wilderness into a place called home.